There we go.
Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out again with Peter Erickson. He's with a great YouTube podcast that's called Conversation Among the Ruins, and we're going to talk about the crumbling U.S. empire. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon again, and we are hanging out once again with Peter Erickson. If you've been living under a rock on the internet, you haven't heard of Conversation Among the Ruins, but I have, a number of my favorite podcasts or whatever you call them. I don't know, YouTube shows. And right up there at the top with the Duran is Conversation Among the Ruins. I really, really enjoy it. I learn a lot. And I think Peter has a great take on things and understanding of international geopolitics. Peter, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
All right, so let's do this. Let's kind of go back and forth. First of all, let me ask you this. I don't have to ask because I've seen you discuss this subject before. I've watched you listen to you discuss this subject before. We'll go back and forth of what do you think are some of the signs internally or externally? What do you think is a major sign that you see, a major thing that you look at and you say, that's definitely a sign that the U.S. empire is in decline or deteriorating or crumbling or however you want to put it?
Well, I don't know if there's a single sign. I mean, there are a lot of things. And I think in a recent conversation with my son, we pointed to there are three legs to this Western hegemony. It's American-led Western hegemony. There's a military leg, there's an economic leg, and then there's the soft power leg. And all of them you can see are getting wobbly. You have to, I think you got to point to different things for each and every one of them. Just like as far as the economics goes, this is, to most of us, it's not very interesting, but I think it's highly significant, is that the bond markets have been in real turmoil. Because what the bond markets, that tells you right there, that is long-term confidence in the U.S. economy. Why is it that not only, organizations, companies, but central banks around the world have been putting billions of dollars into the U.S. economy by buying these bonds? They buy U.S. debt. It's because they have this confidence that the U.S. economy is going to be there. It's a safe haven. And so they've been willing to, get ridiculously low returns on their investment just because it was so safe. And that has made things really easy. It's been a huge benefit to the U.S. economy over the last few decades because we can get basically this free money. But recently that seems to be coming to an end, and that is hugely significant. We'll see how far it goes, how rapidly it goes. But I think maybe we're seeing, the wobbling of one of these legs right here. The rates have been going up high. And when rates go up high, that means that, hey, they're not selling. People are not buying them like they used to. And we're talking about central banks. They're looking at it and saying, I'm not sure about the U.S. anymore. I think that's hugely significant right there. But then, let's look at the military side. I think.
Well, before we do that, I'll have a comment that I think is directly related to that. Right before we leave economics, I would throw a comment, and that is this. It's kind of like a person is an addict, and their life things are going bad. Whatever their addiction is, drugs, alcohol, you name it, right? And they recognize, I'm in trouble. Things are spiraling out of control. My wife's leaving me. My job's gone. All these bad things are happening in my life. And I got a problem here, right? And someone says, okay, dude, you got a problem? Yeah, I recognize it. What are you going to do? Well, the first thing I got to do is sit down and have myself a drink to get myself together. It's like, they're in deep trouble. They ain't going to get better, right? Okay, as long as they have that mentality. Okay, here's my point. The Trump team comes in, and though I think we'll agree that his solution for the problem would only make it worse, was not the best solution, but he recognized the problem. You're right. He comes in and he says, man, we are in deep trouble economically and we got to do something. Okay. He recognized that there was a problem. My God, and he starts off things I don't agree with. Let's just lay off a bunch of federal workers. Well, I disagree with that. And one of the things that I said was, look, they're going to raise the Pentagon budget by more than they saved laying off people. We'd be far better to put the money back in the economy by putting it in the hands of working class, because you have some kind of a exponential magnifying effect by at least the money going back into the economy instead of getting wasted. Okay, so here's my point. So Trump comes in, at least start off, he says, we got an economic problem. The Biden team didn't. Okay, what are you going to do? Well, let's see. We're going to raise the Pentagon budget by $150 million. And we're $150 billion. And we're going to more giant tax cuts for the rich. And we're going to make my tax cuts. And I'm like, you came in and you said, we got a problem with an addiction, and I better sit down and start off with getting myself a drink. I think the world looked at it. I believe that may be a reason the bond markets are crapping out, because people say, okay, the Trump team realizes there's a problem. We don't like what they're doing, but they realize there's a problem, what they're going to do. And they said, we're going to make the deficit even bigger. And the world said, okay. No,
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, they obviously don't have a plan. That's clear to solve this problem. And then on top of that, you have all this tariff craziness, and that adds to the uncertainty. And it did damage, I think, the reputation of the U.S. as a solid, predictable kind of, again, a safe haven for money for around the world. And now I say, we don't know what these people are going to do. They're in deep trouble. They don't have a plan. That's all true. Right. They're addicts, and they're alcoholics, and they're just sitting down and taking another drink. This isn't working. I'm going somewhere else.
Yeah. So economically, the first, and I'll say this, the foundation of U.S. hegemony, economically, we can sanction people. Economically, we can print money indefinitely, and we can build more military. So the foundation of the empire, particularly now that it's a finance capital empire, right? It's not an industrial empire. It's not a commodity empire. It's a finance capital empire. So as the finance capital leg of it starts to weaken and people lose confidence, which is the only thing our economy runs on, is the confidence of people. The whole empire has to go. It's like the whole empire has to crumble on that.
Yeah. No, it's a very good point. Especially when you move away from making real things, then all these intangibles become increasingly important. And, I think the foundation of all these intangibles, these financial services and so on and so forth, and then the general faith and the soundness of the U.S. economy. The foundation is just faith. In the end, it's faith in the future, faith in the U.S. And so you need to understand that, and you have to be very careful about preserving it. It may be an unfounded faith, but if you realize you move into a company and you look at you ask the accountant to show you the books, he said, oh my God, we got a real problem. You don't go out and trumpet that, you say, okay, but everybody really believes in this. Let's at least work with that while we start working on the real problems. Let's keep that faith that people have in us. It might not be very well founded, but we can work on the real problems, and with the support that we're getting, because of our past successes, maybe we can turn things around. But I think that one thing that Trump has done, like all these problems that we're talking about, like weaponization of the U.S. dollar and the debt, and obviously these long preceded Trump, but he's come in, and I think through his actions, whether intentionally or unintentionally, he's kind of just shown a light on them. And then, it's, and he's squandered away again that faith that people were willing to place in the U.S. Now they're stopping and say, well, wait a second, what have I been doing? Why have I been putting my money there? Yeah, these numbers aren't adding up. Let's look at some alternatives.
I think another element, since we're still staying on let's say a little bit more on the economic part of it, the signs that the U.S. empire is crumbling, and that is this. In order to maintain, I saw a poll, and in China, like depending upon poll, as many as 98% of the people in China have faith in their government and have a positive view of their government. Well, you know what? A country that has pulled 800 million people out of poverty, I can think of 800 million people that will give you right off the bat on that poll are going to say, yeah, but materially, their lives are improving. Right. In Russia, I have friends that have been there recently. A lot of people, I know people that are there, and they're saying the same thing. Wow, materially, our daily lives, the place is cleaner, buildings are going up, there's more jobs, things are happening. Right. You have to deliver for the people in some way, shape, or form. In the US, materially, we're going in the opposite direction. Right. That's a crumbling empire, because you have to in some way deliver for the people or they become restive.
Yeah. Well, yeah, another, I think a very important statistic is mortality, life expectancy. And the US is one country, one of the very few, and maybe the only developed country in the world where life expectancy has been falling over the last couple of decades. Now, that's a very bad sign. It tells you something is seriously wrong here. And yeah, I think all of us know, just like, driving down the interstate, I'm amazed by how many potholes there are. I've got to, weave through traffic just to avoid them. And every time I curse, I think about all the money that went to Iraq, or that's, going to Ukraine or whatever. He says, but you can't fill the damn potholes. And not everybody has the same reaction that I have, but people notice it. It's in general, life is not getting better. And that's what the polls showed too. Most people expect that life for the next generation will not be as good as it was for the previous generation. And that is a stark contrast to what's happening in China. And again, I can speak from pretty direct experience. My son Charlie was there for a good 10 years. And had a lot of contacts. He founded a company, and he had all these employees, and he spoke to them a lot. And yeah, they were just very confident. They'd seen their lives get better. Their life was a lot better than that of their parents, and they saw these constant improvements. And while he was there, he would see skyscrapers just going up, and at extraordinary rates. You get out on the balcony, you look over there, say, wait a second, I don't remember that being there yesterday. but that's the way it was. And then it's the same thing in Russia. It's just that I think a lot of people are suspicious. I think in the recent presidential election, something like 86% of the vote went to Putin. And they say, well, this can't be, obviously this must be fixed. They say, well, no, you think about it, he's like President Roosevelt, but carried, times 10, because you think about where they were in the 1990s, and people understand, that's very recent memory for them, the horrors of the 1990s. And now they see these material, obvious improvements in their lives. They're eating better, they're dressing better, they have more leisure time, the cities look so much nicer, they're safer, everything. And their life expectancy is improving. It really took a dive in the 90s. But unlike ours, it's been improving, and they're catching up with the first world, with Western Europe and other places. Very close to those levels now. And they will soon reach them and maybe surpass them. We'll see. So that's just a fact. Anybody, people will hide behind, especially in the case of Russia, there's this constant demonization, and people talk about it as a third world country. I think the solution is just to put those people on a plane and fly them into Russia and let them spend 2 weeks, and they'll come back. And I tell you, 99% of them was, I was completely wrong.
I think also that and maybe I use this word too much, but I think it's quite appropriate. I think that the economic situation in the United States is inextricably linked to the what I would say is the political collapse of both parties. And here's what I mean. The Democratic Party clearly fell apart. Their traditional constituencies stayed home or voted for Trump. Constituencies that they've had for decades and decades, some generations, in 4 years, just got up and walked away or stayed home, right? Went up and vote. Of all things, we were told that Trump is the demon, the evil, the racist, all these things. And people out of economic desperation said, hey, you know what? Anything's better than here, right? So we saw a collapse. But meanwhile, one could argue that the Republican Party, the died, that it's the Trump party, that the MAGA, which is the descendant of the Tea Party, right? The 2008 Tea Party, which turned into MAGA to some point, or Trump commandeered it, I would argue, but that took over that Republican presence, that the Lindsey Grahams and those people of the world are holding on. They still have power in the Senate and voting power, but they got to be afraid of Trump. Lindsey Graham knows if Trump goes to South Carolina and starts preaching about how bad he hates Lindsey Graham, that Lindsey Graham's days are numbered. He doesn't want to see what happens if that happens. So to some extent, I argue that even the Republican Party, to some extent, has collapsed into following Trump, looking for a way out. Anyway, your thoughts on what I consider a political collapse of both parties due to economic dire straits?
Yeah, I would say just in general, about the Democratic Party, it used to be the party of the working class. It was the party of labor. I remember that as a kid and, my early adulthood. And that was kind of how you could predict how things would turn out on that basis, who would vote, by and large. The capitalists, the country clubbers, they voted Republican, the members of the unions, they voted Democrat. And that has really changed. The Democrats have basically abandoned the working class. And I would say they've kind of been, what are they? Lifestyle liberals or something, and globalists. They've bought into the globalist vision and the neocon vision. And then, on the Republican side, I think there's a lot of confusion. I mean, it's just like they're starting to understand that, just as while the Democrats lost the working class, they started to lose the corporation. The Republicans at the same time were losing the corporations and the country clubbers. It used to be that was safe territory, but there's obviously been kind of a switch there. But you still have a lot of it seems to me Republicans, the establishment Republicans, the older ones, don't really understand that. They're still comfortable with the old way, and they still talk like that. And but they understand there has been some kind of revolution, and so that they've had to at least pay their respects to the new king, who is Trump. But as far as real believers in this revolution, which we'll call MAGA not as a personality cult, but as a principled America first, in other words, end the empire, end the globalism, and focus on the needs of ordinary people, working class people. I think that people who truly believe in this and are trying to deliver on this are still a minority. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think about somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene or as one of those people. But in the rest of them, I don't know. Maybe this is true of both sides. They're just kind of careerists. And they're just holding their finger up and they're waiting, seeing which way the wind blow, and they're mouthing slogans, but they don't really believe in it. They don't even fully understand it, I think. So I think this revolution, if it's going to happen, it still has a ways to go on the Republican side. And on the Democrats are just kind of lost. They've abandoned their old base, and they've gone deep into transgender politics, whatever. Just generally turns off the vast majority of people, especially working class people. And sometimes we'll read an article like on the New York Times, say, hey, maybe we've gone too far on this. And there's maybe some sort of awareness at the edges, but in general, they just don't seem to understand what's happened. And I don't know if they're going to get out of it anytime soon. I think it's time for some new parties.
Yeah, I think that with the Democrats, what they did, I've argued this, when they have completely abandoned working class policies, right? Policies of supporting the traditional left, suspicious of concentrated power, suspicious of corporations, anti-war, pro-organized labor. Those were traditional left. When the Democrats decided to completely abandon that, they needed to something to define themselves and say, we're the left. And what they did, they redefined the left to mean LGBTQ, social issues, making sure that every advertisement had one black person, one white person, one Indian person, one, you know what I mean? That now, if you turn on the television and every show looks like a Benetton ad, that's redefined as the left. So they can't let that go, because how else do they define themselves as the left? And you'll hear the conservatives say, yes, look at that, all this left transgenderism stuff. Well, that has nothing to do with the traditional left, but they had to have some definition to say they're the left. And so they've created that. And now everybody says they're the left. And I say, well, then what does that make me? You know what I mean? And the truth of the matter is this. I've traveled to true left countries in, say, South America, the Venezuelans, you go to Nicaragua, you go to the actual socialist countries. They're actually pretty conservative when it comes to, very conservative when it comes to what would be considered the traditional family values things. They would align with the Republicans on those issues because they have nothing to do with left. Now, when you talk about the other things like, free healthcare and, they're traditional left. So I think what we're looking at is a crumbling empire that is coming unraveled ideologically. Nobody knows who's the left, who's the right. What about these two parties? Where do they stand ideologically? And that has to do with they're trying to get money to get reelected. So you have a system that is corrupt, extremely corrupt, laundering money, fighting for the same donors for money, and not representing the people in any way. And that is part of the unraveling empire, the internal unraveling, if you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah. No, I think too, actually, it's important to mention, we're talking about the base and whatever. And, obviously the base of a party is very important to that party's survival and future. But unfortunately, we can't just talk about the base. We have to talk about the mega donors. And the truth be told, it's like when somebody's running a campaign, they don't just, take these polls and find, well, the majority of people support this. They say, where am I going to get my money? And so that's unfortunately a lot of what's going on here. And like the average working class people just don't figure into that. They don't have the representatives. Now, Israel has its, we all know about that. They have their mega donors, but then also, a lot of these other issues that are maybe not important to, or actually go contrary to the way that most working class people think, they have the money working against them. I'll give you an example, and that is just, let's say, immigration. It's just that in general, working class people would really like to see that slow down. They're not necessarily in favor of deporting people or whatever, but they understand that they are suffering economically. And, the more that, workers like themselves that are brought into the country, the more competition they have, their wages are depressed, it becomes harder to find jobs and so on and so forth. Their economic interests are clearly in favor of some kind of restriction to some extent. I think there's no question about that. But there's no money for that. The money is with the corporations who would actually just love to see this constant flow of labor. And this is one of the things where I think the Democrats just completely flip-flopped. Because you go back to even the 1970s. I don't know if I ever saw this picture, but I was told that it exists. There's a picture of Cesar Chavez, the Chicano activist in California, and Walter Mondale. They're standing at the border, and it says, go home. You say, what's going on here? But see, back then, it really was about labor, and they understood that these people, it's not like there's any anger against them, but hey, you're being used to actually undermine our position over here. It's something that capitalists are in favor of, this free flow of labor. So this is the thing. It's just like, you may have a majority of people with a position, but again, the money often talks in a different way. And I think that's what we find happening in both parties. Like with the Republicans, I think increasingly they're starting to starting to understand, hey, we've got this new base. Where do they come from? Maybe we got to at least pretend that we care about them. But I think the money isn't telling them to do that. So actually, we're getting sort of a consensus at the top on a lot of these issues, which again goes against the interests of working class people.
I think both in the U.S. and in Europe, one of the things that's happening as a result of centuries, and then maybe not centuries with the U.S., but centuries of colonialism, right? For instance, you had any number of countries where a colonial country, everybody in that country, was a subject to the crown, and therefore they could come back to France or Britain or wherever it was, right? So what you have had over the course of time is, as a result of collapsing the economies of these other countries with the US and, the Monroe Doctrine, right? That one of the things that's happening now is some chickens are coming home to roost. And I mean that as far as immigration, right? So we overthrow the government of Guatemala repeatedly, and then these other countries, Venezuela, we've got 1 million sanctions on them. Venezuelans are showing up. Right. Haiti, look what we've done to Haiti for all of these generations. Haitians are showing up, shockingly. And so one of the things that's happening with immigration is we've got some chickens coming home to roost from a long time of destabilizing these countries so that we could access their natural resources for virtually nothing. And some of what's happening now was inevitable in the US and in Europe. And the people don't know how to deal with the chickens coming home to roost from years of destabilization, doing, colonial imperial things around the world.
Yeah, I think it's particularly true, or maybe most obviously true in Europe. Why you have so many Syrian refugees, Afghan refugees. I haven't heard the name of that country before. Yeah, clearly, the wars, the meddling, and so forth have greatly exacerbated the problem.
Yeah, exactly. So there's just a confluence of so many things. Now let's talk about foreign policy, right? Foreign policy, and I think we should start here for obvious reasons. The crumbling empire morally, which also has to do with soft power, right. Saying, oh, we're going around the world for democracy and human rights, which, okay, that wasn't true, but they made that argument, right? And various things, and we're the good guys, and we're trying to help, and we want right. Oh, you're doing something wrong in that country. We have to stand for international. And what's happening in Gaza right now is pulling the rug out of all of that. I think there's a moral collapse worldwide and even internally. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that the damage that the war on the Gazans, I wouldn't dignify it with the Gaza war. It's the war on the Gazans, has been huge in the case of Israel itself, but also its backers, because we are clearly complicit. This war would have ended a long time ago if it wasn't for our constant support. And we may be able to hide that truth from ourselves, but we can't hide it from the world. The world sees it, and they're shocked. I think that a lot of people really, just like they wanted to believe in the solidity of the American dollar, they wanted to believe in the fundamental goodness of America. And they held it up as a standard by which they measured their own country, their own government. And that was really very much to the benefit of the American empire. You don't even have to spend money. You don't even have to, to buy people, or you don't have to actually occupy land militarily. If you have this aura of goodness, then people voluntarily, just turn towards you, support your policies, want to redirect the policies of their own governments to be, more in line with the U.S. It's been to the enormous benefit of the U.S. over the decades. And so I don't think you can really underestimate the damage that has been done by the horror in Gaza. Because again, it's a horror that just cannot be hidden from the world. Again, many of us in the U.S., because of devotion to the notion of American goodness and the Zionist cause, are working hard to hide this truth from ourselves. But the rest of the world sees it, and they're reassessing Before those feelings of, that willingness to believe in American goodness is evaporating. And, so that's not just, okay, well, we're not so popular anymore, who cares? But that changes things. That's going to have an effect on policy, on the fundamental orientations of these countries over time. And we're seeing that, so increasingly, a lot of these changes are rather gradual, like you see in the Middle East. It's not like they all flipped over to Russia and China. But they're now, where they were very firmly aligned, I'm talking about Saudi Arabia and UAE, and these countries. They're very, very close, very tight with the U.S. in the past. They're now, they're staking out a neutral position. And it's very clear. They realize that it's important to diversify and, not to rely solely on the U.S. It's partly because of domestic pressures. Their own people are very, very angry about what's happening in Gaza. They're outraged. And so they know, their people know that the U.S. is making this possible. So they just can't have that same tight relationship that they once had. And then they're also seeing all these other things happening. They realize, okay, the U.S. isn't that rock of stability that it once was. We can't put all our eggs in the U.S. basket. Let's move over towards BRICS, Russia, China, and the rest of them. So you see that happening around the world. And a big part of that is, it's not just economics. It's a big part of it is the moral leg of that's getting wobbly in the stool too.
Yeah, and I think to some extent it's tearing the United States to pieces, because we're seeing now people who are being, arrested, deported. We're seeing what's happening on the college campuses, and I think there's a feeling among a lot of people in America that our constitutional rights have been abrogated, to the Zionist cause. And I believe, sadly, but I believe this. There will be that Judaism itself will suffer, that Israel is doing great damage to Judaism worldwide, and that there will be great anger and blame towards Jewish people, innocent Jewish people that are fighting against what's going on in the genocide. That there's potential problems for Jewish people as a result of what's happening, and certainly politically, there are a lot of people in the U.S., me being one, who will not forgive the politicians for their involvement in this.
Yeah. Well, yeah. First, just on the question of how Jewish people are going to fare. Yeah, I think there is reason to be concerned. If I were Jewish, I would be concerned, for the future of my people. It's so easy to blame it on anti-Semitism, but there's this obvious real anger directed against Israel that's fully justified. And then the problem is that you have the government of Israel, Netanyahu in particular, who is always identifying, his country, is pointing out, hey, we're the Jewish state. He's making that association himself. You say that's why you need to support us, because we're the Jewish state. And if you don't support us, you're an anti-Semite. Well, unfortunately, what happens is that over time, I'm not saying that this is going to happen with everybody, but they say, well, then I guess I'm just an anti-Semite, or this is just all about Judaism, as you keep on saying, then I don't want to have anything to do with this. And I hate this phenomenon, whatever it is. And that's, I think, the damage that Zionists in general are doing, but in particular, like Netanyahu is trying to, make this identification. And so, in the end, if you want to point to the number one cause of anti-Semitism in the world, I would point it at Netanyahu, who is making this equation, and which is inevitably going to have negative consequences. Let's hope that it doesn't get too serious, but I think inevitably. And we can just see, again, it's just like, this is a real genocide, and people are seeing it, and it's having some individuals are just snapping already. Of course, we had those cases of self-immolation. Aaron Bushnell is, the one who died. But then also we had recently, the shootings too. And, these are all terrible incidents, and I fully condemn the shootings. I'm not going to make any excuses for that. But it's something, people are under a lot of pressure. Sometimes, occasionally I'll see some images from Gaza, and I have trouble sleeping at night.
Yeah.
You just take that. Somebody who's already maybe sort of unbalanced and is seeing this stuff, things are going to happen. This is, again, first of all, the reason this needs to stop is that innocent people are being killed. This is a genocide. But then, if you don't care about that, like you just don't care about these people, you ought to care about it because of all the other consequences. And one of, the damage to American soft power, if what your main thing is just American power, then you ought to be concerned about this. And if your main concern is you don't care about much of anything except the whole question of, you're afraid of anti-Semitism, well, then you should be really opposed to that. There's no matter what, if it's just a matter of self-interest or it's a moral stance, this has to end.
Yeah, I certainly agree. We're talking about some of the indicators that the U.S. empire is crumbling. Certainly Gaza. Let's talk about something else I think that's critical. And I think that's something that you've been talking about. And that is, and this is important. 1991, the U.S. comes out and shows, look at this. We've got smart bombs. We've got Tomahawk missiles. We've got stealth planes. We've got this and that. And they had an air of technical military invulnerability. People were afraid, oh my God, they've got all these things. We have no chance against them. We might as well we've got to go along with what they say. Now, one of the areas that has been devastating to U.S. hegemony militarily is the Ukrainian technological war. People are seeing the Russian hypersonic missiles. They're seeing the Patriots, the missiles getting blown to smithereens. They're seeing the Western tanks, and people are looking at Western war material saying it's not effective, that the Russians are easily destroying it. And I think that there are people such as Iran. Yeah, I know Iran's looking at that saying, well, it's not what we thought it was. China has to be looking at it saying, it's not what we thought it was. And add one more thing to that. And whatever technological advantages that we did have, Russia has the opportunity to grab the stuff, to take it in, to deconstruct it, and to come up with ways to defeat it and to pass that off. Hey, here you go, Iran, China, North Korea. There you go. We've cracked the code, so that whatever technological advantages the U.S. may have had or technological prowess has been that's been wiped out in Ukraine. And I think that's important. It can't be overlooked.
Yeah, no, I think it's huge, and people who are really paying attention, are seeing this. The U.S. has rolled out a series of weapons since the start of the war, and with each was was accompanied by this great fanfare, or this this great drum roll. Here it comes. This is the one that's gonna make this is the game changer. And I can remember, we forget about all these, but, one after another, the HIMARS, the Excalibur artillery shell, the small diameter.
M777. How about that? The
M777. Yeah, some of these went really fast, but, each one, oops. Wait a second.
You're still here. You're good. There. Yeah, you're fine.
Okay. All right, good. All right. Yeah. So anyway, each one of these was introduced and said, well, okay, yeah, we've held back, but now we're going to introduce the M777 or the HIMARS, and each and every time, they would be announced, it would be introduced, it would be used. It might have some sort of limited success. In some cases, it never had any success, never had any impact whatsoever. But like the HIMARS at first, caused some problems for the Russians. But then a month or two later, you didn't even hear about it. And the ATACMS, that's one after another. You can easily go through and name a dozen of them. And this is supposed to be the best of the U.S. arsenal. This is what's supposed to, we were holding back, but, now we're taking our gloves off. Now you're going to see. And each and every time, okay, the game changer, well, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the next game changer right now. A lot of people have a very limited attention span, and I think they just kind of go from headline to headline, and they have the feeling that, we're now with this new thing, the F-16, that was another one. That'll make the difference. Now there's talk about the Taurus missile, of course, that's a German missile. But, if you're really paying attention and keeping score, you say, well, wait a second. Each and every one of these was just neutralized by the Russians. Like in the end, the ATACMS, there was that very scary decision to lift the restrictions on ATACMS going into pre-2014 Russian territory. And that was very dangerous again because it required direct NATO participation. I mean, they actually have to operate the missiles. They got to program them. So it was going to be, this Russians pointed out, this is going to be a NATO attack on Russia, undisputed Russian territory. Well, we had something easily a dozen attacks, sometimes consisting like 5 or 6 missiles, and one or two actually got through and did some damage, killed some Russians. And but the vast majority, again and again, you'd hear like 6 missiles were fired, all 6 were shot down. The Russians don't get them all, but they're getting a very high percentage. There's no system in the world that will get everything that's foolproof, but they have essentially neutralized these. And don't tell me that they're not going to share that knowledge with their friends. This was again very, very damaging to the U.S.
Well, there's one thing that was more, I think, if there was anything, if it was possible, I'll put it like this. Technologically speaking, it was very damaging because a lot of our weapons were proven to be not what they were cracked up to be. And of course, the Russians were able to get their hands. In fact, the Russians had a display, I think it might have been in St. Petersburg or Moscow, where they had all of the things that they had captured. They had like a HIMARS and all the M-triples, all the things that we'd sent. They had one. Some of them we sent over and they literally purchased from Ukrainians. That as soon as they hit the ground, some Russians were like, "Hey, we'll give you 300,000 for it. Let's bargain for it." And with the corruption there, what the hell? Hey, well, give me 80 grand, it's yours. It cost Americans, 80 million to build it. We'll sell it for 80 grand. What do we care? We got it for free. So you had that happen, right? So they were able to take apart our technology. But there was something else that was really bad. Yemen.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on how that damaged the U.S. military reputation?
Right. Well, I think it's just an extraordinary story, this attack on Yemen. Let it be understood that began way back, I believe it was 2014, that Saudi Arabia started attacking Yemen, in particular the Houthis, with the full backing of the Americans, American targeting. And, it's kind of similar to, the Ukrainians in Ukraine. Hey, again, the Americans weren't just selling them the weapons, they were helping to maintain them and providing with target data and so on and so forth. And they, the Saudis and I believe it was also the UAE, bombed Yemen, a very, very poor country, the poorest in the Arab world, for years and years. And then finally, it was the MBS realized this just wasn't working. He's not I wouldn't say this is a good man by any sense. Of course, he's responsible for that terrible murder of the journalist. But he is a realist, it seems clear to me, and he's quite intelligent. And he just realized that this wasn't working. So he said, we're not doing this. You're
still on. We can see you fine.
Okay. All right. And then I'll continue.
You freeze a little bit for a second, but everything's fine. We can still hear you.
All right. No problem. Well, anyway, then, of course, under Biden, after the Houthis, the Ansar Allah, imposed this blockade on Israeli-linked shipping in the Red Sea, we also began attacking the Houthis. And it went on for some months. Yeah, I can see you. For some reason, my screen is black.
Your screen. Well, you know what? Why don't you do this? Just you're frozen. Just sign out and sign right back in. Okay. Oftentimes, a lot of times it's StreamYard.
Okay, so I just click on Leave Studio here.
Yep, just Leave Studio and then sign right back in.
Okay. Leave and open uploads page. Okay, I guess.
All right, so we'll hope hopefully he will just click on the link and come back in. And what we're talking about right now is the various signs that the U.S. empire is crumbling. And what we were talking about at that point was Yemen. There's the issue, when it comes to Ukraine, there's real physical and kinetic issues. Oh, there we go. Let's hope this all works. Okay. All right, there you go. We're good. Okay, we're talking about Yemen. Excellent. So sometimes if we ever have a problem, I've had a freeze up or lose, you can sign out and sign back in. That usually fixes it. Okay, we're talking about Yemen.
All right,
the
yeah.
Yemen
So
conflict.
anyway, then of course, under Biden, because of what do you call it, Operation Prosperity Guardian, and so he bombed them for some months, and then finally just gave up. But then Trump came in. It's like, Biden, he's such a wuss. I'm the tough guy. We're going to teach him a lesson, and he went after him. To the nail for a good couple of months. What was it, 2-3 months? And it was the full power of the American Navy there in the Red Sea against this extremely poor country. And in the end, he said that the Yemenis asked him to they gave up essentially. They begged for him to lay off. So that there has been.
Yeah, I gotta laugh at that one.
Yeah, right. The thing is that you say the agreement that they made is say, okay, well, you stop bombing us. We'll stop firing at your Navy. But we are not going to lift the blockade on Israeli-linked shipping in the Red Sea, and we are not going to stop firing missiles at Israel, as long as they are committing this genocide in Gaza. So in essence, doesn't that tell you that the U.S. achieved nothing? And in essence, they lost. And this was extraordinary. A lot of this information came out, I think, in the New York Times and other publications that the U.S. really tried to penetrate Yemeni air defenses. They tried to carry out decapitation strikes. They tried to degrade their missile capabilities, and they failed. Their aircraft could not fly over Yemeni territory, and they had to steer clear, because the air defense remained. They were unable to defeat it. One thing that we saw was, I think, a total of 22, 23, maybe more of those surveillance drones were shot down. And that was actually critical to the U.S. effort, because they were up there trying to find targets, and if you can't see, if you don't have eyes in the sky, then you don't even know what you're firing at. So at the end, they ended up firing at civilian targets, really committing a lot of war crimes. And then one of them, I think we probably know about, Trump bragged about on his Truth Social. But yeah, it was Yemen, you can say, just clearly defeated the U.S. Navy. And I think that is an extraordinary turn of events. And the whole world, and it's, above all, Iran has got to be looking at that. And because, Iran clearly does help Ansar Allah. They send them missiles and technology and provide them. But Ansar Allah, no matter what, they call them in Chinese the Sandal Army. These guys are very, very poor, but they've proven with this new technology that they can fight toe to toe with the most powerful Navy in the world. Again, it was this Navy had to, it wasn't just the U.S. Air Force that had to steer clear of their air defense and keep away from their airspace, but the Navy had to retreat up into the northern part of the Red Sea because, there was a risk of one of their ships being sunk. And I think we all saw, or at least heard the news of how the aircraft carrier, the USS Truman, was fired at and had to take evasive action. It had to turn so sharply to avoid the incoming Yemeni missile that one of the F-18s on board just fell off. That was, I think it was the third F-18 that they lost.
That was the second. Well, that was the second. The third one was, if you remember, it was on a Tuesday that they said, we're out. We're done. We're not doing it. And on the next day, they said, oh, and by the way, another F-18 fell off yesterday. And I thought, I'll put it like this. When F-18 start going down, start disappearing one every 2 days. I mean, one was like Sunday, and then Tuesday, another one slipped off.
Yeah.
I start getting suspicious if maybe the air defense isn't causing more problems. I don't know. Maybe they did slip off. Maybe the Yemenis said we shot one of them down. I don't know what happened. But there was also a report that an F-35 was painted by radar, fired on, and they had to get that one out of there. So one thing became obvious, and that was the heat was far too hot for the U.S. Navy.
Yeah.
Let me show you something real quick that a lot of people might not know that also makes me suspicious. if you recall a while back when the ATACMS came, when the Russians said, if you start firing ATACMS at us from Ukraine, one of the things that we can do is we can possibly provide arms to some people who are enemies of yours, right?
Right.
Here's an article today from TASS. Russia-Yemen talks wrap up. That's today. Russian President Vladimir Putin and Yemen's Presidential Leadership Council Chairman Rashad Mobala completed their talks. They talked about good prospects for economic cooperation in the agriculture and energy sector, prospects for the development of trade and economic ties. International affairs were also brought up. There we go. So here's my point. After the U.S. says we're out of Yemen, the Yemen leaders suddenly show up in Russia and they're shaking hands and setting things up. It seems to me that when the Biden team were in there, they lost a Reaper drone every so often. When the Trump people came back, they lost one a week. F-35 started getting painted. Things started mysteriously slipping over the sides of F-18 started mysteriously slipping. It seemed to me possible, I'm not saying it's even probable, that the Russians could have provided them with some more updated technology that they didn't have. And when the Americans went back in this time, the situation wasn't as quite hospitable as it was before. It wouldn't surprise me if there were some reciprocal actions taken when the ATACMS, because that was threatened, not specifically the Houthis, but there are a lot of people who said, well, could the Houthis be? So what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, that's certainly a possibility, because like you said, there was, when the Americans first threatened to use the ATACMS, on places like Kursk, pre-2014 Russian territory, the Russians floated a possibility to say, okay, well, you're supporting, a proxy to make attacks on us, more than supporting. You're actually kind of pulling the trigger, but let's just say that you're supporting this proxy. Well, there are proxies around the world that we could, where we could reciprocate, where we could supply, some, pretty sophisticated weaponry too. And a lot of people thought, I don't think the Russians ever said this officially, but I know a number of analysts said, hey, maybe they're talking about the Houthis, or maybe this is what these rumors are about. And there was, I remember a rumor, it's probably better than a year ago, that the Russians were considering providing ship-killing missiles to the Houthis, and the Americans talked them down from that. And I think maybe they promised, okay, yeah, we heard about this. That would be really bad. We promise we won't introduce this other weapon system here in Ukraine. So there has been this talk about a Russian-Yemen connection, and I know that the Middle East Eye reported that Russian arms or weapons were supplied to the Houthis. So none of this is confirmed. It's sort of like it's on maybe it's more than just conjecture. There have been reports. It's not the sort of thing that I think governments go out and say out loud, but there's been discussion of this. And you just kind of look at a map and you look at the Russian situation. How are they going to? Where's one of the pressure points where they can respond to, for example, the ATACMS escalation? And then you look and you see Yemen, and that's an obvious point, because it's really quite easy for Iran, I think, to supply Yemen through Oman, and and of course, Iran and the Russians work very closely together.
Let me show you something from TASS, which is the official Russian newspaper. Watch this. This is just from today. Articles in TASS. Yemen's internationally recognized government relies on Russia's support. President. Russia grateful to Yemen for cooperation in international arena. Joint settlement in Yemen now irrelevant issue for Russia-U.S. contacts. Putin believes Russia and Yemen have good prospects for cooperation in the energy section. So clearly, it seems to me that now that the U.S. isn't directly firing back and forth, that Russia is being more open about its alliance and support for Yemen.
That may be true. Maybe, like with all these they may be aware of this move to supply the Taurus missiles and to lift the restrictions on the ATACMS. And this may be their way of signaling, that, hey, we have ways of retaliating.
Two can play at that game.
Yeah.
I think you're right. Now, let me ask you this. We'll finish up with this, and we're talking about the crumbling of the empire and indicators. Last indicator, we couldn't go without this one. The economic, clearly, what was an economic attack on China and how that turned out.
Yeah. Okay. Right. It was 145% tariffs on China, which essentially means like no more products from China, because you just, with the exception of a very few that just can't be bought anywhere else in the world, not in the short term anyway. And then it was 145%, and then 125% that the Chinese placed on American products in retaliation. So essentially, trade was coming to a stop. Now, the Trump and his people seem to be very, very confident that Xi Jinping would be calling him up and begging for mercy. That the Chinese government officials would be like all those people, all those other presidents and prime ministers around the world that, according to Trump, kiss my ass. He was going to get the same treatment from the Chinese. But the Chinese held firm. And what we saw was, okay, for a few weeks, there's no effects because there are all these products in the pipeline. They've been put in containers. The containers have been put on the ships, and they're crossing the ocean. But then you notice, I think it was shortly after you began to see an interruption in supplies on the West Coast, because that's where it was going to hit first. That there was a sudden drop off in containers, and the ports were having to lay off dock workers. Truckers didn't have any containers to pick up, and I think it became clear that, hey, this is for real. This is our shelves are going to be empty. People are going to go into places like Walmart and wander into the the whatever department, the toy department, or the looking for a fishing pole, and there's just going to be nothing there, and then all hell is going to break loose, and this is going to be a political disaster. I know that I think shortly before Trump announced that this deal was going to be made, or they were talking to the Chinese, there had been a meeting between him and CEOs of major retail chains like Walmart. It was a disaster that was right there on the horizon. It was just starting to happen. They had to do something. It was either all this tough talk about, there maybe go through a rough patch, but we're going to win this in the end. I think they started to truly panic, and they met with the Chinese in Switzerland. And they agreed to roll back all those, the 115% that on both sides. So now we have 30% on Chinese goods, which is still significant, and we're going to see the effects of that. That's going to have an inflationary effect, but the shelves won't be empty. So we've been saved from that outcome. There was. I've said that I think Trump became president like probably 20 years too late. If he became president, back in the early 2000s, he could have done something like this and pulled it off, because at that time, China was so dependent on the U.S. that they would have been forced to capitulate and to deal with him. But things have changed. It's a whole new world. We don't live in the unipolar moment anymore. There's what is it? I think 15% of Chinese exports go to the U.S., which is, is significant. But then also exports that's a relatively small part of their economy now. It used to be a fully export-driven economy, and most of those exports, or half of them, went to the U.S., and they were utterly dependent. Now, they can say, hey, we'll take a little hit. We might lose 2% growth. That's significant, but we can do it. And the thing is, everybody knows that it's not our fault. It's just kind of like Russia when all the sanctions were imposed on them. and it caused some temporary economic pain. But people knew where the pain was coming from. It wasn't the stupidity of their own government. It was the malice of the foreign governments. And I think that's particularly true in China. They saw this and they were going to say, yeah, okay, I'll tighten my belt a little bit if it's necessary, or even a lot if it's necessary, because people can't kick us around anymore. The Chinese are very proud people, and the Russians are too. But they had this experience. They called it the century of humiliation, from the early 19th century into the 20th century, where they're subject of all kinds of occupations and attacks and wars. And they just got kicked around a lot. And so that's one thing. It's really like the legitimacy of the current government in China really rests on the fact that, no, we can hold our heads high. We don't get kicked around anymore. The century of humiliation is over for good. And the Chinese all understand that. So I think it was a real mistake. Clearly, I think, first of all, he didn't understand the economic facts. Trump didn't when he launched this war. But he also didn't understand the Chinese people. They're just not going to say, oh, well, I might lose, my uncle might lose this job temporarily, I'd capitulate, just surrender to the, no, they're not going to do that.
The last thing, real quick, because you have connections to Taiwan, I did want to ask you this. I had heard a few weeks back or a couple months back that there were protests in Taiwan that weren't being reported here, that there was some political destabilization going on in Taiwan, that maybe there were some people pushing back against Western control and puppetry, shall we say. What do you know about that before we go, and did anything come of that?
Yeah, I know that there were quite a bit of protests because my wife, who is from Taiwan, told me about that. She was quite excited about it. And, Taiwan is a very divided society in general, and particularly in its with the question of its connection to China. As you have a situation that is, somewhat similar to what you had in Ukraine, where, clearly, actually, Taiwan is very closely tied to China culturally, historically. It's just the language. Well, it's a dialect, but it's one that's shared by the people on the other side of the Taiwan Strait. They actually right over, they speak the very same dialect, and it is a dialect of Chinese. The temples have Chinese sages and Chinese saints and whatever. It's the holidays they celebrate are Chinese, but there is this pretense among the independence people that we have nothing to do with China. The extremists on that side, they have their own extreme nationalists, like the Ukrainians have their own extreme nationalists. We have nothing to do with the Russians. Clearly they do. It's just like everybody else looks at it and says, you guys are really similar. You obviously, the language you speak, the food you eat, everything, there's obviously very, very close ties between Ukrainians. And I mean, I'm not talking about the Russians in the East, but even the Western Ukrainians and Russians. So you have something similar in China, but there's an attempt to establish a separate identity that's connected to the West. But there are Taiwanese that are very resentful of that, including like my wife and her sisters who still live there, and they're very upset by these attempts to actually erase Chinese history and connections with China. They are proud of what China has accomplished, and they would like to, in some form or another, be close to China. Maybe, as a province one day, but whatever, that they want to maintain that connection with China, and they don't want to, to break off and become independent. It's just, again, it's very similar to what we saw in Ukraine. It's just that Taiwan has said that's, or not Taiwan, but rather the PRC has said that that's a red line. If you declare independence, we will attack. We cannot let that happen because you are part of the Chinese territory, and we're not going to let Chinese be divided. In the independence folks, well, again, they look to the U.S. That's the big 800-pound gorilla that allows them to push towards independence, to get right up to that red line. Now, hopefully, it'll they won't ever cross it. We won't ever see any bloodshed there. We'll see a peaceful unification. I think that's certainly still possible. But yeah, the risks are there, the tensions are there, and yeah, the resentment, the opposition to what the government is doing is there. Again, you were speaking about these protests. Those protests were real. They were very large. But they don't get coverage. We get a very simplified view of what's happening in these countries. They're always like the brave Taiwanese people, or the brave people of Hong Kong, or the brave people of Ukraine that are standing up to, Chinese aggression or Russian aggression or whatever, what have you. And a more nuanced, a realistic view is say, well, no, these are actually very divided societies, and there are a lot of people within these countries that want to be with China or want to be with Russia. And maybe we should not get involved, let them figure it out, but we don't do that.
Yeah, I think you're right. But we will see. I think the weakness and the deterioration, you could make an argument that the deterioration of U.S. military and economic power make it more difficult for the U.S. to lash out militarily. But at the same time, those same factors make the U.S. The empire more unstable and less rational. So you can make an argument that it would be more likely to. So I guess we will find out. Thank you very much. We've been talking with Peter Erickson. Peter has a great YouTube show called Conversation Among the Ruins with him with his son Charlie. I never miss a episode, and hopefully you'll go over there, check it out. If you like it, subscribe and watch it also regularly. And Peter, hope to have you back on again soon.
Thank you.
All right. And everyone, don't forget, follow me on Rumble, follow me on Rockfin, and you got Patreon and PayPal and all that stuff. Buy me a coffee if you're of a mind to contribute. Either way you look at it, share this on all your social media platforms. And of course, I've got my P.O. box there scrolling across at the bottom. If you want to mail anything, that's where you want to mail it to. Thanks a lot. Peter, hope to have you back again next week, and certainly appreciate the discussion.
Okay. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We're out.